Well, greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Herbert C. Kelman Seminar. And we are so happy that you have chosen to come and be with us today. I know we have a lot of registrants because this is such an important topic that we're covering again. And before I talk about more about the seminar and our wonderful speaker, I just want to remind you that this seminar is co-sponsored by the Program on Negotiation at the Law School, Harvard Law School, and the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs, also at Harvard. We have a great team of people who make this seminar happen. We've got Nicole Bryant, we have Diane Long, we have Lindsay Sullivan, and Lara San Pietro. So I want to say thank you to all of them for making this seminar possible. And as you might know, that we have been reporting on Ukraine. Well, we've been having our seminar focus on Ukraine every semester because we feel that there's nothing more important at this moment to have an up-to-date analysis of what's happening on the ground. And as you know, for those of you who have heard our presentations before, Dr. Alexandra Vacroux has also been with us for almost this is her third session with us to keep us informed. And unbelievably, lucky for us, she is actually in Kyiv. So and I'm going to introduce her in a minute, but I want to just remind people what the format is, that Alexandra will be giving her remarks for about 35 to 40 minutes, after which we will take questions from you, the audience. And I want to apologize in advance because we never get through all the questions, but thank you for your, put them in there anyway, because we'll send them to Alexandra and she'll have them. And just also to remind you that this seminar will be recorded. Maybe in a day or two, you can go into the Program on Negotiation website and get the recording, and maybe you want some friends to listen to it, or you might want to listen to it again. Yes, so as I mentioned, we are just thrilled to have Alexandra back with us again. She is currently the Vice President for Strategic Engagement at the Kiev School of Economics in Ukraine. In this role, Alexandra is focusing on connecting the Kyiv School of Economics with top faculty, schools, and programs around the world to strengthen their organization and their platform, and that could build Ukraine's human capital. Her scholarly work addresses Russian and Eurasian policy issues, including obviously the war in Ukraine. As Director of Graduate Studies at the Davis Center here at Harvard, she has mentored. She's done that role for about 15 years, and she has mentored dozens of Harvard students and regional experts. She continues to manage the center's Scholars Without Borders program, and she has her PhD is in government from Harvard University. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Alexandra. And once again, thank you so much. Oh, there is one other thing that Alexandra alerted us to, that because of so much activity going on in Ukraine right now, sometimes there are sirens that they have to react to. And so if a siren goes off, she may have to go into a safe space, a safe area. She said it only takes a couple of minutes, but so she will continue. We'll just push the pause button for a couple of minutes and she'll find her safe space in the basement and she'll continue. So yes, welcome back to you, Alexandra.
Thank you so much, Donna. Thank you to everyone who turns in, who's tuning in, and who still cares about Ukraine. I deeply regret that I have to be giving this kind of presentation for the third year in a row, but I'm honored to do it, and I know that Professor Kelman had a soft spot for Ukraine, so I'm really happy to be able to be back with you again. Now let me share my screen. And as you can imagine, this is going to be a pretty intense presentation, but stay with me and hopefully we'll have time to get to questions at the end. So let me say at the outset that I am indeed in Kiev, in Ukraine, working for the Kiev School of Economics while on leave for Harvard's Davis Center. But the opinions here are completely my own, and of course, the opinions and the perceptions of an American observer. Now, we have a lot to talk about. The focus of the talk is going to be on what's likely to happen in Ukraine over the coming months, and perhaps going out to the next 12 months. But I'm going to start with an overview of the current state of play on the ground before talking about what a Trump or a Harris foreign policy would look like in terms of Ukraine. Before I get going, though, I want to remind you that with this subject, as with all subjects, framing is everything, right? The way that policymakers in the US or indeed academics speak about Ukraine is very much a reflection of their point of view and can vary dramatically in the same way that the situation in Kiev or in Western Ukraine is very different from what's happening in the East, in the occupied territories, or on the front line. So I could illustrate the situation in Ukraine with this picture of Vovchansk, which Bellingcat recently described as totally flattened by the Russians. Or I could illustrate with this picture, which I took in a sunny day in Kiev in mid-September. I could talk about how much Ukraine has suffered in this unjust war, how exhausted the population is, how worried we are about staying warm in the winter. Or I could focus on how resilient Ukrainian society has proven to be and how the war has consolidated Ukrainian identity and a desire to be a full-fledged, even a leading member of Europe. And also on the incredible startups that have been launched in dozens of sectors of the economy, from drones to delivery services, indeed to even education. As always, the world is complicated. No one needs to remind Americans today that countries are made up of individuals with different experiences that shape their understanding of their lives and their views. And the same is true in Ukraine. So with that caveat, let me start with a map. This is a map that focuses on the southern part of Ukraine, which is where the conflict is focused. This is where Russia has seized Ukrainian territory and is trying to grab more. There's an active and deadly fighting along the front line, the 600-mile-long front line, every single day. And that's the dark red line you can see in the middle of those oblasts. We don't know how many Ukrainians have been killed, but it's not a negligible number. It's north of 50,000, with many more wounded. And Russian losses, which are also not officially publicized, are estimated to be at least twice that. The Ukrainians have used a military strategy that places a higher value on human life, and they provide better tactical medicine at the front line, which is why their losses have been less numerous, but are still extremely significant. Every loss is significant. Now, I want to draw your attention to one feature of this map and thank my friends at the Institute for the Study of War for providing it and producing it, is that the Russians have claimed to have annexed, meaning written into their constitution, these 4 Ukrainian oblasts, or regions: Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, in addition to Crimea. But in fact, they only fully control Luhansk Oblast. You can see the purple line, which is the border of this region, basically is within the line, within the area that's occupied by the Russians. But if you look at Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, you can see that the Russians do not even hold or occupy all of the territory that they claim to have a right to. The other major change on the ground this year has been that the Ukrainians made a surprise incursion into Russia, into Kursk Oblast. Now, the amount of land that they took is pretty small. If you look at that inset map on the left, or in the inset of the inset, you can see that little purple speck is the area that's occupied by the Ukrainians. But the offensive had an important symbolic value. It showed that Ukraine could take the fight into Ukraine. And it's demonstrated also that, which is very important, that Ukraine's way of fighting war is different from the way the Russians fight wars. The civilians are not terrorized, the property isn't desecrated and trashed, except by Russian soldiers who have been pillaging their own villages as they pull back. Though I have to admit that yes, Lenin statues have suffered from the Ukrainian incursion. Now, if Ukraine can hold on to the land that they've occupied, they might be able to trade some of it in eventual negotiations, which was likely one of the goals of this incursion. But the other goal is that the Ukrainians have managed to trade some of their rather clueless conscripts that they captured when they went into Russia for Ukrainian POWs. Russia, however, is still holding about 22,000 people, 8,000 of whom are POWs and the rest of whom are civilians. These people are being held in essentially concentration camps, and if they're being traded 30 to 100 people at a time, you can imagine how long it's going to take to get them back. This number also doesn't include the children that have been abducted from Ukraine and are now scattered across Russia and are going to be very difficult to find and bring back. Now, the incursion into Kursk was a success for the Ukrainians, but these have been few in the past year. The New York Times published this graphic last week showing that the latest Russian counteroffensive has been bringing results. And indeed, Russia appears to have some kind of momentum. The territory that Russia has gained month by month is in red, and the territory that the Ukrainians are gaining is in blue at the bottom. You can see that the Ukrainians haven't been as successful as the Russians in the past year. However, Russian gains have come meter by bloody meter and at a great human cost. NATO estimated in May that the Russians were losing 1,000 soldiers a day. And just yesterday, November 3rd, the Ukrainian General Staff reported that the Russians had had 1,300 soldiers killed or wounded in one day. The other major development is that North Korea has now sent troops to Russia to help fight the war. Secretary of State Blinken, these are, by the way, not North Koreans dropping into Ukraine. It was just a training exercise. They came in through Vladivostok and have been carted across Russia in trucks. The Secretary of State Blinken said that some 10,000 North Korean soldiers have arrived, and many of them are already on the border, the Russian-Ukrainian border near Kursk. But North Korea has been instrumental in helping Russia since September 2022, when it started providing shells. By some estimates, it's providing half of the artillery that the Russians are using. And at a conference where General Budanov, the head of military intelligence, was speaking in September, a journalist said, what do you think about the fact that Iran and China are helping Russia evade sanctions and helping in the war? And he said, none of that is as important as what North Korea is providing to Russia in terms of shells and artillery. Now, presumably, Kim Jong-un is hoping that out of gratitude, Russia is going to share military technology that's going to improve their nuclear weapons delivery system, which is why the fact that the Koreans are now in Russia fighting Ukraine should matter to all of us. The deployment of Koreans to fight in the war is an escalation of exactly the kind Russia has been warning NATO not to consider, which is to say, don't put foreign troops on the ground. And what has been the US response? Well, pretty much so far, the geopolitical equivalent of thoughts and prayers. Secretary of Defense Austin had said that this was very, very serious. Apart from that, there has been no reaction. While attention has been focused on the North Koreans, Russia has intensified the drone and missile attacks against Ukraine. Here you can see a graphic representation of the daily attacks in Ukraine. Yesterday, Zelensky said that Russia had launched this past week 900 guided aerial bombs, 500 drones, and 30 missiles against Ukraine. Apartment buildings are being hit regularly, particularly in the east, in Kharkiv, for example. And civilians in Kherson, which is also in the south, report that they're being chased in the street by armed drones, which Russian troops are apparently calling human safari. Kiev experiences air raids almost every night and often more than once. On Sunday morning, for example, this past Sunday, we had 5.5 hours of air raids between midnight and 7 a.m. And I spent a lot of time sleeping in my closet, saying a silent prayer for effective missile defense systems. Meanwhile, and more seriously, Ukraine's army keeps fighting on the front line. Drones and electronic warfare have been critical in the war, but it's likely artillery that's going to determine the outcome on the battlefield. Both countries still rely heavily on Soviet doctrine that emphasizes artillery. Russia is firing about 10,000 rounds a day, Ukraine about 2,000, largely because they don't have any more than that. And initially, Ukraine relied on Soviet-era stockpiles of artillery and ammunition, in addition to what NATO was providing. But Ukraine is increasingly in a stronger position now that it can produce both 155 millimeter howitzers and the corresponding artillery shells. Ukraine's long-range weapons have steadily increased in reach and power as well. Neptune cruise missiles and sea drones that are made in Ukraine have been amazingly effective. And without a navy, Ukraine has managed to force Russia's Black Sea fleet to relocate from its main base in Crimea into safer Russian harbors. This has also allowed the resumption of grain exports from Ukraine to the rest of the world. Ukraine has used its aerial drones to attack sites within Russia, particularly Russian infrastructure and oil refineries, some of which are even 1,000 miles into Russia. I would remind you, though, that Russia is about 5,600 kilometers across, so that's significant, but it's not that much of a dent in terms of Russian territory. However, it was a big change because in the first year of war, Russia could hit military and civilian targets across Ukraine without being afraid of getting hit at home. Ukraine has managed to bring the war to Russia, though while avoiding civilian infrastructure, unlike in Russia. Now, you probably will have heard that Ukraine wants the US and the UK to allow it to use the weapons that they've provided to Ukraine to strike Russia. And so far, they have not received permission to do that. There are 245 Russian military and paramilitary assets that lie within the 300-kilometer range of American ATACMS, for example, which are longer range systems, but Ukraine cannot use them to attack Russia. This means that Russia can comfortably maintain the soldiers, equipment, and logistic centers it needs to wage the war in Ukraine close to the border without worrying that Ukraine is going to strike back and remove their capacity to move those assets to the front. Ukrainians are resilient but exhausted, and many people have been displaced more than once. Children whose schools don't have adequate bomb shelters haven't been in a classroom since before COVID. So there are kids who graduated from high school and never set foot in school. Kiev School of Economics was one of the first schools to build shelters in the basement, so we were able to have online classes continue even as the war was raging because we could move all the students down into underground shelters whenever there was an air raid. But Ukraine is tired of facing an enemy that, among other things, enjoys making double-tap strikes that are aimed at killing first responders, like the ones who rushed to this scene in Odessa in March. In the middle of this horror comes the American election, which has created not only uncertainty in the United States, but around the world as well. Until tomorrow, Harris and Trump are focused on each other and beating each other, but here in Kiev, we've been thinking about what a victory for either one would mean for Ukraine. Let me try and parse my understanding of how each of the candidates approaches Ukraine and foreign policy, and I'll start with Trump. Now, Trump is a believer in personal chemistry, right? He wants a good relationship with the leaders he admires, and these tend to be strong men who rule without checks and balances and who don't worry about being reelected and who don't have problems taking advantage of weakness when they see it as being to their advantage. On the day Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Trump said admiringly at Mar-a-Lago, quote, "Putin's taking over a country for $2 worth of sanctions. I'd say that's pretty smart. He's taking over a country, really a vast, vast location, a great piece of land with a lot of people, and just walking right in." Foreign policy is transactional for Trump. You do something because you get something else in return. And he has said that he knows that Putin always wanted Ukraine. That means that he's probably thinking that if he can give Putin Ukraine, then he can ask him for a big favor. We don't know what that big favor would be. During the presidential debate in September, Trump said that he would stop the war in Ukraine right away. Now, let me say, I don't think there is a single Ukrainian who wants this war to continue for a day longer. But successfully ending a war is a very complicated thing. Negotiating the armistice in Korea, for example, took over 2 years and 158 meetings, and the fighting was at its most intense during those 2 years while both sides were jockeying for a better position. Trump's plan seems to hinge on forcing Putin and Zelensky into a summit and then having them make a deal thanks to his impressive negotiation skills. Some have speculated that Trump would threaten to cut off all aid to Ukraine unless Zelensky allows Russia to keep the territory in its seized. It's unclear if there's anything that Trump would threaten Putin with for not signing the deal, or indeed if he would ask him to make any concessions. One thing is clear. Trump believes that Ukraine is mainly Europe's problem, and Europe, in his view, has been free riding on US largesse for far too long. His skepticism of Europe was clear during his first term. In 2018, at the G7 summit, which is when this picture was taken, he complained that America was like the piggy bank that everybody is robbing. This now ties into his attitude towards Ukraine. In April, he wrote on Truth Social, quote, "Why isn't Europe giving more money to help Ukraine? Why is it that the United States is over $100 billion into the Ukraine war, more than Europe, and we have an ocean between us as separation? As everyone agrees, Ukrainian survival and strength should be much more important to Europe than to us, but it's also important to us. Get moving, Europe. Look, if European countries aren't going to pay, we're not going to protect, okay? Is it true that Europe isn't paying its fair share for defense? Well, first of all, we should point out that NATO is not a joint bank account where everybody is supposed to pay their share, and that some people are delinquent because they're not paying into their share, and therefore the United States has to pay for them. That's not how it works. The way it works is that there are targets of how much each country should spend on defense, and the target has been 2% of GDP. And many European countries have been very slow to get to that level. It's true that Europe is spending far less than the US as a percentage of GDP on defense. And this map shows how different countries spend, how much they spend on defense. So the darker the blue, the more they're spending in terms of percentage of GDP, and the darker the red, the less they're spending. NATO states that are most at risk of being attacked by Russia, the ones closest to the border, you can see they're all blue, because they're more concerned. And the 3 Baltic states aim to spend 3% of their GDP, whereas Poland spent 3.8% of GDP in 2023. Other countries that face security threats tend to spend more on defense, the same amounts. So South Korea, for example, spends 2.6%, the United States spends 3.4%, and Israel spends over 5% of relative to GDP. J.D. Vance has been more articulate than the top of the ticket and has said, for what it's worth, that Trump would not pull the US out of NATO. He's also made it clear, however, that he doesn't really care about what happens to Ukraine. So in other words, if the Trump-Vance team is in the White House come January 21st, 2025, aid for Ukraine is in trouble. I'm going to point out at the end of this talk, when I swing back to this, that this position is based on assumptions about Russia that are fundamentally wrong and misguided. But first, let me talk about Harris. Kamala Harris's comments on Ukraine have followed Biden's, and her aides say that she doesn't plan to weaken the position that Biden has laid out. There are some indications that Biden may actually use the last few months of his term to lock down some of the aid to the extent that he can. Some people call this Trump proofing, but I doubt that it's really that effective. The problem is that the Biden position is not a strategy. As long as it takes is seeming more and more like to the last Ukrainian. To many, this is tantamount to providing enough support so you can keep fighting, but not enough to win. And continuing this policy isn't great for Ukraine either. Now, Harris doesn't have the decades of experience with foreign leaders that Biden brought to the presidency, and Putin will try and test her. For example, in September, he slyly suggested that he supported Harris over Trump as a way of undermining her. And Harris knows that. She knows that he's going to test her, and that might stiffen her resolve when it comes to standing up to Russia by supporting Ukraine. Harris has said unequivocally that supporting Ukraine is in the national interest of the United States. And there are, by the way, Republicans who agree with her, although they're reluctant to come out against Trump. So what is this argument that Ukraine is vital to national security? The argument is that it is in our interest to uphold the international rules and norms like sovereignty and territorial integrity. These principles are the basis for the international system that the West created after World War II, the system that has bolstered American security and prosperity for decades. If we don't defend the primacy of these principles, we allow our adversaries to assert their own, and of course, they will privilege their interests over ours. This is part of the drive between the BRICS movement. BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. It's sort of a club of the global South, which is now expanding. And they had a big summit in Kazan a few weeks ago. This is a class photo from that meeting. And you can see that even though we call Putin a pariah, there are a lot of people that are still coming to his parties, including the Secretary General of the UN, who outraged many by attending an event hosted by Putin, who has been indicted by the International Criminal Court for war crimes. It is in the interest of the United States to defend democratic values and stand up to dictators. Not doing so weakens the US position around the world. Our withdrawal from Afghanistan, while perhaps inevitable, led many to conclude that the US is unreliable. We get tired of supporting countries and we just walk away. And those who wish to control other countries can play the long game. They can wait till American energy and resources and interest wane and then move in. This is Putin's position. He's always thought that democracies are weaker than autocracies, in part because we hold competitive elections. We do give the right to voters to elect their presidents every 4 years, unlike Russia. Putin has been in power for 24 years, by the way. So what do American voters think? Here we can see Trump supporters and Harris supporters and their positions on Ukraine. Not surprisingly, their positions mirror those of the top of the ticket, with Trump's supporters far more skeptical about continuing to support Ukraine. Regardless of who wins the American election, significant aid to Ukraine is going to have to pass through Congress. And right now, 538, one of the leading forecasters, sees the Republicans as most likely to win the House and the Senate. Now, that's not a certainty, but it means that even if Harris wins, the odds of divided government are very high. And passing controversial legislation, which aid to Ukraine has become, is going to be difficult. The US has spent about $5 billion a month on Ukraine since the war began. But according to Zelensky, only 10% of the last big package, the $61 billion passed in April after a long delay, has made it to Ukraine, 10%. So that means that the aid that the United States has already allocated is going to be trickling into Ukraine for a while. The United States is providing Ukraine with half of the military aid it requires, most of which, by the way, goes directly to American manufacturers to make more shells and Patriot missiles and the like. But without continued support, Ukraine is not going to be able to continue fighting on the front line in the same way that it has. So let's think about what would happen next. How do wars end anyway? Well, the outcome is partially dictated by how things turn out on the battlefield. But absent any decisive battle like Waterloo, whether parties continue to fight or decide to escalate is determined by 4 factors that transcend the battlefield. So first, how do Ukraine and Russia perceive their prospects of victory? Do they think they're inevitably going to lose? No, neither side thinks that right now. Do they think they're going to win? They're not sure, but there hasn't been information from the battlefield that convinces them that they're going to lose. The second factor is the cost that they're paying, the military cost, the economic costs, and the human costs. And both countries have to evaluate how important these are to them and how long they can bear them. For example, in Russia, the counteroffensive appears to be quite, like in full swing right now, but there are indications that Russia would not be able to continue at this pace come next summer. The third factor is international and domestic pressure. And the fourth factor is the confidence that the sides would have that any agreement would actually be enforced. If countries think that continuing to fight is better for them than stopping the war, there is no incentive to stop. Now, there's a whole body of political science literature that's focused on war termination, and let's look at the data. Between 1946 and 2005, there were 63 interstate conflicts. Only 21% of them had a decisive outcome in which one party was the winner and the other the loser. In other words, a total victory for one side. Almost a third of wars ended in a ceasefire, and only 16% were concluded with a peace agreement. The remaining cases had an outcome without a clear victory or defeat or peace settlement. Now let's focus on those peace settlements, the 16%, and consider what they look like. On the left, you see that of negotiated peace settlements, almost 4 out of 10 broke down and the war reignited. And if we look at how they broke down, or when they broke down rather, we can see that 3/4 broke down within 2 years, 12% lasted 2 to 5 years and then broke down, and 12% lasted for more than 5 years and then eventually broke down. Wars that end in a tie rather than a decisive victory for one side, especially in places like Ukraine, where countries share an acrimonious history and where one side's existence is threatened, are significantly more likely to be repeated. In other words, you can fantasize about brokering a ceasefire in 24 hours, but you shouldn't think that this is actually going to end the war. For one thing, Russia is occupying 18% of Ukrainian territory and has subjugated some 5 million people. So imagine, as a thought exercise, if Russia asked the US to give back Alaska, remember it was theirs before they sold it to us, and also demanded that we throw in all the population of the Northeast as well, right? That's the equivalent impact for the Ukrainians. Zelensky tried to pitch a victory plan to Western allies a couple weeks ago, and it did not get very much traction. However, it highlighted the fact that Ukraine will only stop fighting if it can be sure that Russia will stop fighting and not use a ceasefire to rearm and reattack when the world has moved on. 3 components of his plan involved deterring a future Russian attack. There was a request that Ukraine be invited to join NATO. There was a request that Ukraine be given permission to use Western vessels to strike into Russia. And the third was a request to give Ukraine longer range weapons like Tomahawks that would serve as a non-nuclear deterrent to convince Russia that if they attacked again, they would face a devastating strike in Ukraine. None of these went over particularly well in the United States and with Europe. The problem is that Ukraine is skeptical that Russia would respect any agreement without these kinds of deterrent factors built in, because they have violated them before, most notably the Budapest Memorandum. In 1994, Ukraine agreed to give up its nuclear weapons in exchange for assurances that its sovereignty would be protected. Russia also signed this agreement. You can see Boris Yeltsin in the front of this picture. Bill Clinton said that Putin told him in 2011 that Russia didn't actually feel bound by this agreement. And in 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and supported the separatists in Donbass, it became clear that they didn't actually feel bound by that agreement. Signed agreements are not enough to keep Russia from attacking again, which is why the Ukrainians now want guarantees, not just assurances. They want Putin to understand that if Russia attacks again, Ukraine and the West will be responding. One way to do this would be to invite Ukraine into NATO, which is not likely in the short term while the war is hot. The alternative is to find other ways to make it unattractive for Putin to attack Ukraine by, for example, having Western soldiers walk back and forth in a demilitarized zone, or giving Ukraine scary weapons with which to hit Russia in case they're attacked. None of these are likely at the moment either. And as a result, Ukrainians are largely unwilling to support the idea of negotiation. It's not that they reject the concept of a diplomatic solution. There have been regular polls by the Kiev International Institute of Sociology and NDI that have shown that the number of Ukrainians that say that Ukraine should engage in negotiations with Russia to try and achieve peace has increased. 29% agreed in January 2023, and almost double that, 57%, agreed with the statement this May. However, most of the people who believe in principle that negotiations are valuable will not accept giving away Ukrainian territories, as you can see here. There's a lot of information here, but basically Ukrainians were asked, to what extent would you accept each of the following as the price for peace? So the first one, Ukraine reclaims all the territory it controlled prior to 2014. That's fully acceptable to 66% of the population. But once you start reducing what Ukraine would get in exchange, for example, the next one, Ukraine reclaims the territory that it controlled before Russia launched its full-scale invasion in 2022. Now you see 37% find it fully unacceptable and 23% somewhat unacceptable. And the percentage of people who find it fully acceptable is starting to get really small. For Ukraine to claim only the territory it currently controls, 60% say that's fully unacceptable. Ukraine renounces NATO, 49% say it's fully unacceptable. Ukraine renounces its goal to join the EU, 53% say it's fully acceptable. Even if for some reason Zelensky wanted to negotiate, because he lives in a democracy where he will be subject to elections, he cannot override the will of so many Ukrainians to have some kind of territorial results. A deal without security guarantees is not going to be acceptable to Ukraine. And I suspect that the country would choose to continue fighting, even if US support was rather than accept an agreement that doesn't meaningfully constrain Russia going forward. And by the way, if you think that these Ukrainians are being unreasonable, I would point out that the Russian population says pretty much the same thing. Sure, we'd like to sit down and negotiate. Here you see Russian public opinion. Let's focus on the trends rather than the actual numbers. And you can see that Russian attitudes towards Putin withdrawing some troops and starting negotiations has become more popular this year. However, these people are only interested in having an agreement that meets their demands. So if you ask them, what do you think about returning Zaporizhia and Kherson Oblast, two of the oblasts which they don't even fully control, that is not acceptable under any circumstances. Sorry, that should be 67% for May 2024. Over 65% are always saying that that's not acceptable. So where does that leave Ukraine, besides not particularly optimistic about Western support? It means that Ukraine is getting with what it has, and with the US aid still coming through, and with the support of Europeans, they can't ensure military supplies. It means Ukraine has doubled down on domestic defense manufacturing, both through startups and traditional firms, and through decentralized crowdsourced projects like Druk Army, which 3D prints supplies like these and delivers them to the front. You can follow them on Instagram. And there are other things the West can do. One of the most important is to continue imposing punitive sanctions on Russia. The KSC Institute, the leading think tank on sanctions, has calculated that Russia continues to lose billions on oil exports, $132 billion as of August 2024, as a result of sanctions and the oil price cap. That's a serious amount of money for Russia, which we assume is spending between 500 million and $1 billion a day on this war. Now, the way the war has reshaped the Russian economy is a whole different lecture. I won't get into that, but suffice it to say that the stress on the economy is increasing. And one of the key indicators that the economy is overheating from all that defense spending is that the Russian central bank last week raised its benchmark interest rate to 21%. That's not great for Russian. Now, there are some people who will tell you that Russia is not the enemy. It's just an adversary or a competitor. And I want to tell you, my fellow Americans, that while you might not see Russia as a significant threat, Russia sees you, the United States, the West, and NATO as the enemy. The Russian Secret Services, what used to be the KGB, recently released their 2025 calendar. This is the illustration for January. The Russian government's conviction that the West must be weakened explains why Russia is flooding misinformation into media outlets, especially social media. Those fake videos about illegal Haitians voting more than once for Harris, that's from Russia. Stories about Zelensky's corruption and yachts, also Russian propaganda that found its way into the talking points of certain Washington-based politicians. Russia leverages American and non-American influencers to stoke division. It assumes that the weaker we are, the easier we will be to manipulate, and the easier it will be to get control over Ukraine and Georgia and Hungary and the Czech Republic and maybe eventually Germany and France. And this is why Ukraine matters. You might not care about Ukraine all that much. But if you care about a stable world order, an American trade and influence abroad, and about reducing Russia's influence in American politics, you should be wondering what we can do to help Ukraine negotiate a just and secure conclusion to the war. And be grateful that the Ukrainians are fighting and dying so that we don't have to. Let me end with a few lines from Defense Secretary Austin's speech in Kiev a couple of weeks ago. Peace is not self-executing. Order does not preserve itself. And the principles of freedom and sovereignty and human rights do not uphold themselves either. Yes, there's a price to be paid for human freedom, but it is dwarfed by the price that we would all pay for letting aggression go unchecked. Thanks.
Well, Alexandra, It's hard to take in a lot of it. And I really appreciate your balanced view here. And before I move to the questions, I'm curious what you think. How do you think the everyday Ukrainian people, the common citizens, how are they coping with this after so long?
I mean, people are under so much stress, right? I mean, they found inner strength to cope, but in a way, they're very I don't know if the right word is fragile, because they're not fragile people, but when terrible things happened, like the children's hospital was bombed in July, like people really fall apart, right? So they're very strong, they're very resilient, they're very motivated. But the stress and the trauma of the past 3 years are so deep. You know, more than 80% have lost someone that they loved in the war.
80%?
80% of Ukrainians have lost someone they loved to the war, friends or family. Right? It's amazing that they continue, you know, getting up, going to work and fighting for their country in whatever way they can.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you again. Let me just move to some of the questions. I know you've talked about certain paths to potential paths to a negotiated settlement. Is there anything that you think at this moment that's on the table that's really worth pursuing and possible?
So one thing that is happening is that apparently the Ukrainians and the Russians are negotiating through Turkey to talk about agreeing not to hit each other's infrastructure. This is a particularly important question for Ukraine because at least 50% of the energy infrastructure has been hit by Russian missiles and rockets and bombs. And even though there are no power shortages right now in Kiev, for example, there's a risk that if things get very cold and if the Russians hit energy infrastructure, that people are going to start freezing. So there is a sign that the Russians and the Ukrainians are talking over issues that are mutually important. So one is the exchange of POWs, for example, as I mentioned, although they tend to be quite modest, 30 to 100 people. And the other is this question about infrastructure. But I want to say that the Russians wouldn't be willing to negotiate about not hitting infrastructure if the Ukrainians hadn't been able to hit their oil refineries and the other structures in Russia. So it's kind of an illustration of the fact that Ukraine needs something to bargain with. They need to be able to prove to the Russians that they have to negotiate because otherwise they're also going to incur some damages.
Yeah, this next question seems simple, but I think there's some underlying depth to this question. What, in your opinion, is Russia's primary objective for the war, especially thinking of it in a global context, and will it achieve it?
So Russia has always been very clear on what it wants, which is it wants to control Ukraine. It doesn't necessarily need to annex all of Ukrainian territory, but it wants to be in control of at least Ukrainian foreign policy and ideally domestic policy as well. And ideally, that means like they get to the point where, oh, sure, you can have elections as long as it's a Russian puppet that's going to be elected, and that they're going to make sure that Ukraine never joins NATO and probably never joins the EU. That has been Russia's objective.
Okay, here's another question. Do you think the United States and its European allies would be more energetic in their support of Ukraine if there were not another war going on in the Middle East, where the United States is sending significant military aid to Israel and its campaigns in Gaza and Lebanon?
Well, it's difficult to say. I mean, I think that these two wars they're running in parallel. In some respects, they are connected because for Vladimir Putin, seeing Israel and the United States weakened in the Middle East is good for his plans and the plans of the BRIC players. You know, Iran has been an ally of Russia. And in fact, Iran supplied the Shahed drones, which make Ukrainian nights kind of miserable because they're flying overhead all the time. But I don't think it's necessarily a zero-sum game. It's not true that money that would have been going to Ukraine is now going to Israel, right? Israel is in an entirely different line item, if you will, in United States foreign policy. I think one of the issues is that, especially at the beginning of the conflict in the Middle East, the focus that had been on Ukraine, the fact that Ukraine was on the front page of the newspaper every day, that obviously shifted. And so while there isn't a direct relationship in the amount of money that's going to Ukraine versus Israel, I think it is true that people are distracted and people are justifiably very worried about having a huge war in the Middle East, right? That seems extremely scary as well. And for some people, that's viscerally easier to understand and fear than Russia gradually undermining Europe. I think both are equally serious risks if we're looking, let's say, 10 years down the line.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. What line would Russia have to cross before NATO commits troops to Ukraine?
I don't know. I mean, I think it's short of attacking a NATO country, it's difficult to imagine NATO troops being sent to Ukraine. And in fact, there's one of the debates right now is what would happen if Russia invaded a little part of a Baltic country and then pulled back? What would NATO do? Would NATO respond to that? Would NATO respond by attacking only the bases from which those Russian troops had come from? I mean, NATO is having an identity crisis at this point, right? Which is it just a bluff? Is Article 5, this idea that all the European countries will come to the defense of anyone that's attacked, is it all just a big bluff?
Yeah.
And I'm sure Putin is dying to find out, but he's not going to find out by doing anything in Ukraine. He would find out by doing something likely in the Baltics.
Yeah, well, speaking of other neighboring countries, can you comment on the elections in Moldova and Georgia and what that means in the bigger picture for Russia?
Yes, thank you for that question. Basically, what's happening in Georgia and Moldova is the Russian playbook, right? We get a watered down version of it in the United States because we're a much bigger country with a more vibrant press and longer liberal traditions. But what Russia has basically tried to do is find its puppets in Georgia and in Moldova and put however much money is required to flood the media landscape with all sorts of pro-Russian propaganda, and then if necessary, actually stuff ballot boxes so that their preferred candidate comes out on top. Now, the amazing thing is that they did not succeed in Moldova, in part because of Western attention and also because Maya Sandu, the president, is a pretty amazing woman. But in Georgia, they all but have succeeded. And that's in part, again, because the West was very committed. John McCain was a huge supporter of Georgia. But over time, we get a little bored. The ruling party ends up being closer and closer to Russia. And then nobody does anything when the election gets basically stolen. So now you have the Georgians ready to go out on the street, but it's pretty clear that the West is not going to be supporting them. And most likely the Georgian Dream Party, which has been in power for a long time, will manage to consolidate power and consolidate its pivot towards Russia.
So does Ukraine have a good relationship with Moldova and the now new current president is elected president again?
Moldova has been supportive, right? I mean, it is the poorest country in Europe, so it's not like it has that much money to provide. But Moldova is very sympathetic to Ukraine because they also have an occupied territory that Russia has put troops into, Transnistria, since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the fear has been that if Russia is able to control Ukraine, then it will then be able to control Moldova. And Moldova, I would remind everyone, is on the border of the EU with Romania and other countries. And that is part of the plan. Like you gradually roll out your influence towards Western Europe. And even if you don't like take over countries, you still manage to destabilize them to the point where they're no longer an effective opponent.
Okay, thank you. So Alexandra, do you think that there were US foreign policy mistakes that led to this war?
Yes, so the biggest mistake was that in 2014, when Putin annexed Crimea, and then started fomenting separatist movements in the southeastern part of Ukraine, the West basically did nothing. Yes, there were a few sanctions on fancy drilling equipment, oil drilling equipment in the Arctic. But for the most part, Russia paid almost zero price for that. In fact, Germany signed the Nord Stream 2 agreement after that happened in 2015. And Russia's lesson from that was like, okay, so you do something, you take a piece of Ukraine, the West makes a lot of noise, and then basically nothing happens. So they were actually quite surprised that there was such an intense reaction over the full-scale invasion. I remember seeing there was a Russian member of parliament who was interviewed on television, and she was saying, it's unbelievable. Like, how are we supposed to know that the West would think that we had invaded, Ukraine, that this was like invading France? It was just Ukraine. We had invaded it before. So that was a huge miscalculation. And one of the things that Americans have difficulty understanding is that making concessions to Russia incites them to be more aggressive. It does not appease them and make them feel like they got what they wanted and now they can stop.
Yeah, thank you for that. So do you foresee Russia trying to expand into Lithuania, Belarus? I mean, it seems like he wants to reorganize the former USSR.
So those are very different situations because the Baltics are part of NATO. And given how difficult it has been to pacify even a part of Ukraine, I think there is no way that Putin thinks he could take on NATO at this point. He can rattle some sabers, he can make noise about Kaliningrad, but he is not going to attack NATO. And in fact, there was a recent study, I don't remember if it was Bellingcat, that looked at the Russian bases that are on the border with NATO, and basically most of the equipment and the people are gone from those bases, right? They are not going to be attacking NATO anytime soon. Now, Belarus is a different situation, right? Belarus is not in NATO. Belarus is ruled by a dictator. He was called the last dictator in Europe before we revised our criteria. And Belarus has always been a partner, I would say not a reluctant partner, but Belarus and Russia have always been flirting with each other and flirting with some kind of more unified relationship, some kind of union between them. And Lukashenko does not want to give up his control over Belarus, but he's not trusted by the Russians. And he was flirting with the West before the war started. So he has become extremely vulnerable, in part because he required Russian support to fight off an election, a loss that he manipulated in 2021. But right now, he's a very convenient person. The Russians have been able to station some nuclear weapons in Belarus, although Lukashenko doesn't have control over them. They've been able to fly their Shaheeds down from Belarus. They're able to use that as a training base. The reason that there was an attack on 3 sides of Ukraine in 2022 was that some of the troops came down from Belarus through Chernobyl to Kiev, which made the attack on Kiev much more feasible than if Belarus wasn't implicated. So at this point, Putin really doesn't have to do anything to control Belarus. If, however, something happened to Lukashenko, if there were some kind of street protests that he couldn't put down, then Russia would probably feel like they had to put a lid on it in order to keep control over it.
Yeah. And how feasible do you think that is? How likely is that to happen?
I mean, at this point, I don't think Putin has the capacity to do that because all of the troops that he can rustle up, including North Koreans, are fighting in Ukraine.
Yeah.
But if he had to, like he would probably figure out a way to do that because losing Belarus would be pretty significant as well.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. This next question, I've heard different comments concerning regarding Crimea identity, and would like to know how the average Crimean identifies with an ethnic identity. Is it Russian? Is it Ukrainian? And this person says, I very much appreciate your fine presentation. So
Crimea, I mean, it's a little bit of a black box right now because it's occupied by Russia, and Russia has been terrorizing the population that's not supportive of its initiatives. So the Crimean Tatars, for example, who were a very significant portion of the population, are basically getting they're basically being relocated and imprisoned and crushed in Ukraine. In terms of what the population thinks, I mean, the situation was complicated even before 2014 because Russia had based the Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol. And so there was a big Russian contingent of sailors and soldiers and military already in Crimea. And a lot of people who had served in the Navy retired in Crimea as well. So even though the population itself might not have chosen to become Russian, there were enough military assets there that they were able to, with very little bloodshed, basically take over the Crimean parliament and the government. The question now, and it's a difficult question for Ukraine, is, how would you be able to reintegrate that population into Ukraine if it wasn't being held by Russia? And I don't think anybody has the answer to that.
That would be complicated, wouldn't it?
Mm.
Yeah. So here's another question for you, Alexandra. Besides Europe and the US, are there other countries that could play a significant role in the exit strategy for this war?
So one of the questions about having negotiations, right, even if they're between people who don't want to talk to each other, which was the case with the Korean War, is that you need to have some intermediaries that are seen as relatively unbiased, right? That rules out China. It might rule out India, which has been more pro-Russian than pro-Ukrainian. Turkey has been able to kind of walk the line fairly effectively. I mean, mostly by not doing everything that Putin wants. And that's probably one of the reasons that the negotiations or the discussions that have happened, both in 2022 and now in 2024, have been taking place in Turkey. But you would have to find a country that hasn't taken a side, and there aren't very many of those, right? But we shouldn't think that they're all on our side. I mean, there may be 34 countries that have joined the sanctioned regimes, and most of the others would just like this war to end, right? The global South is not outraged by the argument that Russia is recolonizing Ukraine. The global South would like to have their grain deliveries uninterrupted and would like the war to end so that Europeans would stop worrying about other Europeans and get back to focusing on global issues. It's difficult to say who would step forward, but as I said, it can't be anyone who is seen as being pro-Russian.
Yeah. Okay, I think we just have time for one more question, then I'm going to turn it over to Nicole Bryan. Considering that, according to UNHCR, 6.5 million Ukrainians have already left the country since the beginning of hostilities, how high is the forecast of availability of people for the front and for the front line and industries supporting the country's military effort in the future?
Mobilization is a very painful question for the Ukrainians. So they have tried very hard not to mobilize young men who haven't had children, who are part of the solution to the demographic crisis that has been provoked by a lot of people leaving, and of course, people getting killed or wounded at the front. But the draft age was reduced from 27 to 25 this year, and they're having trouble mobilizing soldiers. There have been some ugly scenes of people being pulled out of concerts and things like that. And outside of metro stations, you can see the police checking men's documents. If you ride on a bus, every once in a while you have a checkpoint and people get on and check the documents, mostly of the men, to see if their military documents are in order. But I think that if Ukraine has to keep fighting, if it has to keep fighting without American weapons, Ukrainians will keep fighting. There's some people that I've been talking to who say, look, like, it's so bad already, but obviously we can fight like this. Obviously we can live like this because we've lived like this for 3 years. So if we have to continue living like this, we will, right? I mean, and this level of determination to save the country is something I'm always struck when I'm in the United States and I see the level of polarization and vitriol and the lack of mobilization against it in the US, and contrast that to what Ukrainians are willing to do for their country.
It's really remarkable. It's really remarkable contrast. Yeah, well, thank you, Alexander. We can't thank you enough for giving us such a thorough analysis of what's happening now on the ground. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Nicole Bryant, and I'm sure she's going to thank you too. Nicole?
I'm absolutely, Donna, going to thank you, Alexandra. This was an absolutely incredible hour spent in your presence and very engaged group in the chat who is echoing everything that Donna and I have said. So thank you to you. And we are absolutely thinking about you and everyone in Ukraine right now. For the program on negotiation, you have our list of upcoming events. Our next one on fast track negotiation on November 13, as well as all of our trainings that will be happening either in person or online. And we look forward, of course, to encouraging all of our community members in the United States to exercise their civic duty tomorrow if they haven't already in voting in the presidential election and other elections that are happening around the country. So thank you to everyone and be well. And once again, a big thanks to Alexandra.